Hi everyone. Yeah, this is Phil and this is Phil. It's not Phil and Anneke because Anneke's out in the kitchen working. Um, this is Phil from Sweden. Andy asked me to do a short devotion for you, so that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm, I was reading an article the other day about John, the Apostle John, and the guy was saying, how did John conduct himself while he was in lockdown? John was imprisoned on Patmos. Some say he was underneath house arrest, very much like Paul in Rome. Um, and we read in Revelations chapter 8, Revelations chapter 1, verse 8, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord, who is and was and is to come, the Almighty. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and kingdom and perseverance that are in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of the Lord and my testimony about Jesus. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. That got me thinking. John is underneath house arrest, and he's not moaning, he's not complaining. He's saying, I was in the Spirit. He was in contact with God. He was, prayer, worship, whatever. And God started to speak to him. And it got me thinking, how do we conduct ourselves when we're in prison, when we're in lockdown, when we're underneath house arrest? It's a lot harder for you guys. I have the privilege of living in Sweden, where our lockdown isn't so strict. I can get out and I can go for a walk. I go for a walk every day with my dog. And like I say, our lockdown isn't as hard as yours. So although we do try and do as much I can't remember the words now, self distancing, social distancing as we possibly can. And so we've closed down the church. We have a prayer meeting over Zoom. I put out a little devotion on Sunday mornings on Facebook, and a lot of my work is done over the telephone, just ringing up people to see how they are, and everyone's fine, and that's cool. So the conversations aren't normally that long, but it got me thinking about other people in the Bible that were in these similar situations. We read about Joseph, who, when he was sold as a slave, he was sold to this guy. Can't remember now. Let me see if I can get back to it. That's Acts. Genesis. No, I can't find it. Let me have a look. Jeremiah in the well. It doesn't matter. You can look it up yourself. Joseph. He was sold as a slave. He got falsely accused by his master's wife, and then he was thrown in prison. And while he was in prison, he conducted himself in such a good manner that the prison official promoted him to look after all the other prisoners. His reputation was so good. He was such a good prisoner that his attitude was right. Everything about him was right. So he was promoted to look after all the other prisoners. And then we read about Paul and Silas. Paul and Silas were imprisoned and for sharing the gospel. And in Acts chapter 16, verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. That's important. The other prisoners were listening to them. Think about that later. Paul, when he was underneath house arrest in Rome, he had the time to write Philippians and preach the gospel. We read in Acts that he shared the gospel with the guards that were underneath him, and people would come to visit him, and he would share the gospel. We never hear of him complaining that he was in prison, that he was underneath house arrest. We don't hear of Joseph complaining that he was in prison. they just put their focus on God. And so that got me thinking, how do we react in lockdown? I got thinking to us a little bit about Daniel. He wasn't in lockdown so much, but he was thrown into the lion's den, and at times it might feel that we are thrown into the lion's den if we've got a large family and everybody's struggling to find their space and do what they want to do. And there's where's the peace? Which reminded me of a time that I was working with YWAM, and we would take teams out to do evangelism and to expose them to other situations. And we would get put up in churches, and at times there would be 10, 15 of us in a church, all trying to find our own space. And so I can distinctly remember once trying to find a place that I could be by myself, to be with the Lord. And I found the baptistry. And the baptistry was nice and deep. And everything, all the noise would just go over the top. The noise wouldn't come into the baptistry. And so I would be able to hunker down into that baptistry, sit on the floor. Fortunately, it wasn't full of water. Sit on the floor and have my quiet time with the Lord. I've got the privilege here of being able to go out for a walk, and so when I want to take time out, I often go out for a walk with my dog, take my headphones and my phone, and I play worship music. And that can get me in the right zone to be with the Lord. Listening to worshiping the Lord in my spirit. Got the privilege of being able to walk out into the forest, so it doesn't matter if I'm singing out aloud in my false tones because I've got my headphones on and everything. I was like, it doesn't matter, nobody's here to listen to me. And I can take that time out to be with God, and I can get in the spirit with the Lord. Which reminds me of another situation. When we were in Bible college, we had a visit from a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I invited them into the house, but they didn't want to come in. And so they were trying to persuade me to become a Jehovah's Witness, and I was trying to persuade them that the gospel doesn't work that way, and that Jesus is the answer, and it isn't by works, it's by faith. And got to share with them about Sharp's law in John 1:1, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Sorry, I'm misquoting there. Whereas they say that the Word was a God. And I got to talk to them about the Greek and how the definite article applies or doesn't apply there and stuff like that. And unknown to me, my neighbour, who was 3 metres on the other side of the road, had been creosoting his fence. And he sat on his haunches for a whole hour listening to me sharing the gospel with these Jehovah's Witnesses. And when the Jehovah's Witnesses had went, he got up and said, "Phil, that was so interesting. You gave me such an insight into why you're a Christian." Now, I don't know whether he became a Christian or not. We left college, afterwards, and obviously he went his own way and so forth. But the fact is, he was listening. And so it got me thinking, how do we act in lockdown? And I was wondering, how we can influence our neighbours when we can't speak to them one-on-one. And, you can play your music. Don't play it too loud, but play it loud enough. Maybe go out into the garden. Take your cassette recorder or whatever it is out into the garden, your little speakers and whatever else it is, out into the garden, and have your quiet time in the garden. And have a chat with the Lord. Pray for the people that you pray for. Discuss the things that you discuss with the Lord. Lord, how can I be used in this time? How can I share my faith with other people? because you never know, on the other side of your garden fence, your neighbour might be out there taking in the sunshine, listening quietly to you worshipping the Lord, chatting to God about your day, praying for the health workers, praying for the surface people that help keep the UK going, um, and sharing your concerns with God, and sharing your praise points and your thank yous with Him. And you never know, your neighbour might be listening, and you might be able to drop a seed of faith into your neighbour. It's not often that people get to a close relationship with their neighbours. I remember once asking in a church how many people spoke to their neighbours, and I think out of a church of about 75 people, 2 or 3 put their hand up who speak regularly on a basis with their next door neighbours, let alone 1 to 2 or 3 gardens away. So as a little insight, how do you act in lockdown? Focus on the Lord. Take a chance to get into the Spirit with the Lord, and listen to Him, praise Him, worship Him. And like I say, you never know who might be listening. I want to thank you for your prayers. I want to thank you for your support. I want to thank you for thinking of us. We certainly pray and think about you guys, in the UK, in Crewe, in Williston. Bless you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and I hope it blesses you. Amen. Take care. Be safe.